Good afternoon and welcome to the latest episode of the 1 to 10 podcast. This afternoon, we are traveling on a journey across ESG and private equity and a bit of insight into the world of regulation. Delighted to welcome my guest, Shailen Patel, who is the head of corporate advisory at Macfarlanes. Really kind of long-standing contact of mine, someone who is a well-known face across the industry and at various industry events. So delighted to have you here today, Shailen. Thank you. How are you? You all right?
I'm well, thank you very much. How are you?
Good. Yeah, all good. Thank you. Very well. Cool. So Shailen, look, obviously I've tried to give a bit of background, but we always start off by asking guests to give a bit of a career overview. So if you could give us a bit of background to Shailen and how you've kind of navigated your way to your current role, that would be great.
Yeah, no, sure. So, I mean, if I go back to degree, I studied economics and then went on to do my ACA, Chartered Accountancy, and subsequently was an auditor at PwC for a good few years, but also mixed that with doing a couple of transaction pieces of work and some IPOs and accounting advisory, which actually sort of lent me to moving to EY, where I set up an advisory team for CFO advisory, what was then financial advisory, accounting and structuring. And that team sort of grew out and we sort of offered a broad range of services. So things like accounting advisory, regulatory capital advisory, lots on valuation and investment governance. And then latterly towards my time at EY, doing lots of work on the sort of emergence of ESG and also long-term value as sort of a more focal point for larger firms as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, genuinely, I think then the opportunity came sort of somewhat inadvertently. I actually had left to sort of go in-house, and then various things pandemic related meant that it didn't quite go to plan, as we spoke about at the time.
Yep.
Unfortunately, I ended up working with a PE house just on an asset stake sale, and was working alongside Macfarlanes. Kind of like the way they conducted themselves, and an opportunity came up to sort of explore what it would be like to sort of build a sort of alternative offering around sort of that finance agenda and sort of a bit broader, because I think some of the areas I was covering at EY were beyond just a CFO agenda, sort of breaking into that C-suite agenda more broadly. So what that would look like, and so we've been shaping that out, and it's sort of the role itself and sort of the opportunity was one that sort of worked for me. I enjoy helping people. I enjoy helping clients and sort of finding opportunities for efficiency and just for sort of helping clients to navigate complexity. I know it sounds a bit like a cliche in the consulting world, but actually it's one of those things when you sort of crack something, you feel a sense of joint pleasure, which is quite interesting and good.
No, absolutely. So look, we've already kind of, it's very easy to gauge already that you enjoy what you're doing and there is a passion to behind what you're doing. So talk us through kind of what makes you passionate about what you're doing or trying to build out at Macfarlanes at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I think one, it's the opportunity to sort of do something that actually I don't think is done in the market yet, which is to sort of explore in a way that you can't in a Big Four, because you've always got constant independence conflicts arising. Now in the law firm context, you still have those, but if you can put the sort of quality into what you do, there's quite a lot of opportunity to work alongside some of the drafting and legal agreements you've got in place to position things where there's already been a market view of how something operates. And so taking some of that learning and experience and sort of speaking across the market and seeing what people are doing to form views and to sort of provide good, rigorous technical advice alongside what, you know, as a firm, Macfarlanes are pretty synonymous with the PE industry. So I think that opportunity in itself was quite an interesting one. And I think there's been a constant challenge, I think, for law firms to sort of do more across that C-suite and, you know, sort of engage at a different level. And I think, you know, just some parts of the business just speak a different language. And I don't mean that sort of literally, but actually just the way finance works is different, or risk works is a bit different to the typical legal offering. So if you can sort of mirror that language, you can draw some of the experience of things you'll see in businesses. I think having that opportunity alongside the fact that actually it was quite entrepreneurial to come into Macfarlanes to set something up and take it forward. I think that's sort of been my driver in the mornings of coming to work.
No, absolutely. I guess just a side question, if I could, is obviously it's not every day that you hear of kind of law firms setting up these kind of functions. How have you found the kind of response or appetite for what you're offering within the market?
I mean, there's obviously room for further growth, but I think a lot of further growth. But actually, we've been pleasantly pleased with the response we've had so far. I think quite a lot of that is fortunate. I've had quite a few existing clients who've sort of given work, and some of them have been common clients of Macfarlanes as well, which has been handy.
Yep.
I think the fact that actually what we offer is a little bit different to what your typical corporate advisory function a law firm offers, where it's not sort of going in and doing just process controls and things like that after the lawyers have been in and given advice, but actually doing more around that sort of strategic finance piece and sort of on ESG, linking the strategic finance piece to ESG and how they might conduct investing activity and valuation activity. I think that has sort of allowed us to do something that's quite niche and different, but something that I think firms actually do need if they work out where they're going trajectory wise. So and it's been helpful in terms of, once you see something in one client, actually quite often investors want certain things in certain ways from all clients. So if you're sort of front running that somehow, you can sort of share with many clients, and I think actually that's one of the value adds that we sort of take across our client base. No,
absolutely. You've nicely teed us up to move into kind of topic one by mentioning already, but I guess from the outset, clearly you're advising many within the private equity or the fund space around the topic of ESG. Where do you feel ESG currently fits into the equation of the PE world or the fund space?
I think there's definitely been two areas in PE have been particularly sort of active in this, which is around marketing and investor relations, and then also in terms of actually, and I think sort of perhaps following that somewhat is the sort of deal making and sort of how that's factored into the deal process. I think one of the things we've been helping firms with is sort of navigating where they position themselves in that cycle. And I think through that, there's obviously an opportunity to think about where they are today versus where they want to be. Does that change the type of LP or investor profile they're going to open themselves up to? What will the expectations be today, but also maybe 2-3 years down the line when the LPs become more sophisticated in monitoring their investments around ESG as well? And will that increase the cost base of delivering what's required under the agreements you've put in place, and how that's factored in? Is there any caveats put out? All those sorts of things, sort of thinking those through. And to some extent, there's the ready answers aren't there today, or actually commercially people haven't reacted yet, other than sort of by the allocation of funds and it being something to add to the to-do list. But I think more and more business meet where actually they fundamentally buy into sort of long-term value or environmental social governance, especially the environment and the social part. Because I think governance has been quite a fundamental of PE investing in the past. Obviously, there's sort of change and sort of more formalization you can make, but I think that's quite a fundamental part of investing. But the environmental and social factors that you sort of are having to sort of consider in addition. I think that needs you to be passionate as a business around it, or at least see a business case around it. And I think businesses I see that are sort of really embracing it are sort of wholesale, not just changing their businesses, but the people themselves as people as well, to sort of really sort of understand why they need to sort of take that change forward and things like that. And a lot of work we do is sort of both helping to identify that why, but then also what it means, and then how do you do it. And I think there's been quite a good uptake so far.
No, definitely. I guess my next question is a bit more of it's a bit more personal to yourself, Shailen. With ESG, do you feel that it's a buzzword that's just kind of very topical and current now, or do you think that it's being given the significance that it does actually need in our industry? And that you may loop back to kind of increasing investor sophistication, but just what are your thoughts? Is it here because it's topical, or do you feel there's a genuine desire to adopt certain policies going forward?
I think I'd break it down a little bit into, I think it's here to stay, but maybe the phraseology may change over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly on the environmental front, I think, and I'm no climate scientist or anything like that, but I think from everything you read, it certainly looks quite dire in terms of future predictions, and therefore there's a lot of things that businesses and us as human beings need to do to change. And so on that front, I can't see that going away anytime soon, and the sort of focus and the laws that are coming around in terms of what you need to disclose and make publicly available. And ultimately, I assume the direction of travel will be targets and sort of penalizing firms who aren't performing well, which ultimately will impact performance if you don't address it. So I think thematically, the environment will only become more of an issue for firms to deal with rather than less. I think the social part, I think, certainly in the sort of medium term, I think there's so little understanding of that still. I mean, I see, and you see the difference between sort of institutional businesses and sort of boutique businesses, and some of the institutional businesses in pockets of their business really sort of realize the value, others really fail quite drastically as well. Whereas I think if you're a boutique manager or sort of a mid-sized manager, which a lot of PE falls into, there's a real opportunity there to sort of set your stall out, identify where you see a formula that works for you and how you tap into that market. And perhaps there's opportunity to spot those more readily with sort of greater diversity or greater engagement with your communities and things like that. So I think these forms will stay, and I think the reporting will stay. I think what will come from it is greater opportunity as people sort of look at how can we make money more so from really taking advantage of the sort of growing regulatory burden that's here. Yeah. And so I think it will fundamentally continue to change business. Now, some firms are already really astute around this and sort of have their very niche focuses, but I think you'll see that others will probably follow suit as deal making becomes more competitive.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. And when you are kind of sitting down with clients and advising them around their ESG strategy, how key is the buy-in from kind of the CFO or the COO, in your opinion?
I think it's organizational dependent. So in terms of who we've been advising, we've literally, I think there's a whole spectrum. So I've had sort of CEOs who've been really engaged in the topic and CIOs as well. Sometimes you feel in a firm, and I think these are the firms where, unless they're adequately supported, the ESG integration won't go as well as you sort of left with just the head of ESG and no support from a finance or risk or operations perspective. And so actually really embedding it into the culture becomes quite difficult for that person, especially if they've got a team and they're not sort of sitting in everywhere. Right. And then the CFO, COO in particular, I think at the moment they're probably more informed than they are active as a community in the PE space. But I think that's changing. I think two things that are changing that is, one, as the investment teams are sort of changing their approach to sort of investing, there's a then how do you value these businesses to factor in ESG? And I think there's partly the investment team will do that, but there's a bit of finance rigor or oversight of a vendor that finance needs to provide to that, or the COO will need to provide in terms of checking that. And the second is obviously just the burden of regulation and reporting that's coming. And ultimately, I mean, we've probably heard mooted the term the CFSO, the Chief Financial Sustainability Officer, sort of coming about. And I think in time, you can see the sway, the regulation. You look at TCFD, for example, which actually, when you get into it, it's almost like doing a set of accounts, but on a different basis and different measurement. And so naturally that's going to sit with someone who's doing the year-end reporting or who's doing reporting generally and collecting that.
Right.
And so you could see how this will sort of be an add-on to that finance and operations burden more generally. But also therein comes an opportunity to sort of shape things in a way that it becomes efficient to do that reporting rather than the big run around data collection exercise at the end.
Yep.
So
with that kind of, that you mentioned CFSO, is that something that you feel will just slot into be almost an add-on to the traditional CFO role, or do you feel that it could actually become a role in itself?
I think it depends on the organization.
Yeah.
I think and the size of it, also the culture in that organization. You see some firms have sustainability officers and they'll take the charge for reporting on anything sustainability related. And so therefore you see there's two separate roles potentially emerging. But then there comes this point where your auditors will ask you, oh, how's your financial information consistent with your non-financial information, or vice versa? And are they on the same basis? And sometimes having two different people doing that and two different approaches doesn't lend to sort of marrying it well together in what you're putting out to the external market. Yep. So there's a bit of thinking to do there for firms, and not just firms, but actually this usually it's a CFO who's got a bit of a choice around this as to how much they want to engage with it. And so a little bit's their choice in terms of, do they want to seed that, or do they want to hire into their team to do this reporting, things like that. Yep. And independence of sustainability reporting hasn't been a big focus yet, but I can imagine it will start to grow as a topic, just because ultimately, if you're putting information out, you want it to be independent of the first front office. Yep. And also sort of something that's going to be sort of overseen by your marketing and sort of investor relations team as well. So if that's going to be finance that's collecting that and who are seen in that way and are strong enough, I think that's naturally where perhaps you'll see a bit of it popping up.
No, perfect. This bit's a bit more about you now, Shailen. I guess for those of our listeners who maybe haven't come across you before, or are new to what you're trying to achieve at Macfarlanes, when it comes to advising clients around their ESG policy, how do you approach that task, and how, I guess, what would be your offering essentially in terms of the how you can assist potential clients with implementing a strong ESG policy?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it is actually one that can be quite hard to sort of distinguish, because some clients are pretty standalone and have sort of their approach in mind, have quite a large team allocated to this, and so there it will be finding what their gaps are, or perhaps assessing what they're doing and potentially where they could move to. And it's quite a plethora of things that firms need to look at. So, and the beauty of what we do as a firm in sort of from an advisory perspective is we have got a bunch of lawyers who are pretty expert in their sort of subject matters and the literature that goes with it, which actually is quite useful when you're assessing sort of an approach to something or developing sort of a view around it. But I think, let's say it's a firm that's sort of tentatively looking at ESG, or has had sort of investor demand around it, or has made some claims around ESG, but hasn't done too much around changing themselves as a business to make those claims. Yep. I think there we would potentially help them sort of identify how they want to position themselves strategically. Do they want to be in the pack? Do they want to be ahead of the pack? Do they want to sort of be sort of in the upper echelons? What do they want to badge their products as? And I don't mean necessarily badging them just on everyone talks about the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regime, SFDR, which I think, everyone's used as a badging regime, but actually I think that's more of a burden of regulation regime in some ways, because actually the more you say, the more you have to do as a firm and in your investing activities. But I think it's, actually thinking about what labels you might want to go. Do you want to look at science-based targets? Do you want to look at things like B Corp or whatever it might be? And once you sort of work that out and work out what laws and regulations are in place, and have you covered the gambit of that, and sort of what's on the horizon as well, so you know that what risks you're opening yourselves up to, then sort of thinking about what the governance you require is, what management information you might need to sort of flow around the business to sort of support decision making. And that just won't be into the front office, but also decisions you're making in other parts of the business and who's really taking control and ownership of those. Potentially finding who's ultimately responsible. So going back to the conversation we're having around the head of ESG, sustainability officer, CFSO, whoever that might be, is there one person who's ultimately going to be responsible? They're going to have a committee supporting them, sort of helping them identify that. And then sort of a compliance with specific regimes. So quite a lot of the ones that are more legalistic will sort of have our lawyers advise on. So SFDR is a good example. And I think we've got a market leading offering in this space in terms of just what firms should be thinking out, what they should be doing. Yep. But equally, I think perhaps a bit more nascently, we're doing quite a lot of work around ESG scoring and also around things like TCFD coming in, and what that means in terms of calculating climate VAR or using alternative approaches to alternative measuring approaches, and to what extent you need to quantify. So, and helping firms through that cycle and position themselves in the right way, basically.
Okay. And again, I'm conscious that you've touched upon some of this already, but from our perspective, obviously being on the recruitment end of the spectrum, how have you seen hiring outlooks be impacted by ESG, and have you seen any kind of experience around funds changing their hiring outlook to incorporate an effective ESG policy?
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to think of a client that hasn't hired someone either to head up ESG, or where they've had a head of ESG where they haven't sort of put some scale into that team in the last sort of 12 months. And that might be just an internal rebadging of someone, or allocating someone's time to it. But I think there's definitely been headcount sort of allocated to this area now, and at least to sort of just work out what is going on, what do they need to really think about. I think, personally, I think this is an area that will only continue to grow as firms realize quite how much there is. And bearing in mind, the regulator hasn't yet sort of taken any action in this space in the sort of PE community as such, or, probably beyond some of the really large asset managers like DWS and Boney, there hasn't really been much activity yet from a global regulator either. So there's certainly sort of scope for sort of upticking. You've got, people are going to be doing their, it sort of cuts across a bit on what we're going to talk about in terms of regulation, but people will be doing sort of risk assessments under their internal capital adequacy risk assessment process, imminent for the IFPR. And within that, there is a little bit of thinking about what do we need to do from a climate perspective. And so actually when people are hiring, risk professionals, to what extent do they want a bit more finance and understanding of environmental backgrounds and things like that? I think so there's definitely sort of hiring change coming, and also it has changed over the last 12 months quite drastically, I think.
Yep. And well, look, keen to speak to, we could speak about this clearly for a long time, right? But I guess one of the areas that I know that you're very kind of involved with and passionate about is the investment firm prudential regime, so known as IFPR. I'm not going to pretend.
Passionate's a strong word.
Sorry?
So passionate's a strong word as well.
No, but look, I know it was something that you and I both kind of wanted to kind of talk through. So, and you kind of alluded to it in your last answer. So, I guess we could give a brief summary for listeners as to what IFPR is about and why it's so significant, and then we can, I guess, discuss a few other points around that afterwards.
Sure. So, I mean, the IFPR basically sets out requirements on business on how they govern themselves, what they need to do in terms of managing their capital base, and then how they manage risks in their business, and ultimately ensure that they're going to be able to protect clients and not disrupt financial markets. And there's a mixture of things that firms need to do to sort of comply. The most material of those are ongoing quarterly submissions for regulatory returns to sort of maintain adequate regulatory capital, and for the first time formally liquidity requirements as well. And then in addition, and this is obviously new to most PE managers as well, because historically private equity managers would have been exempt CAD. So from the 1st of January, they would have fallen into scope of this. There's some transitional provisions there that mean that actually the financial impact's pretty limited as long as they haven't varied their permissions or aren't planning to vary their permissions in the short time. But actually going beyond sort of just the sort of mechanical calculations, there's a little bit around the ICARA, which I just mentioned, which is setting out what the firm's governance is, setting out the story of the business, how risks are managed, what potential harms arise from those risks, and how you might go about quantifying those, and then thinking about scenarios and stress tests, and working out whether you want to do a reverse stress test as well to work out how much capital, in addition to what's required formulaically by the IFPR, you might as a firm opt to keep, given the sort of unique set of risks that permeate your business. And so I think personally, it's one of those regulations that firms have taken quite lightly, but is probably one of the bigger changes that's hit, or probably the biggest change that's hit the market in a long while. And it's one that if you just look across the hedge funds market, who became in scope of doing, as buy-proof firms, of doing regulatory returns in the ICAP historically, which PE firms haven't had to do. It's quite a lesson in terms of how active the regulator was with some of those firms reviewing their ICAP, giving them scalers and capital uplifts. And I think to date, the FCA has never really focused in the PE market in quite the same way, or certainly not post-financial crisis. And so this ICARA and the submission for MIF 007, which will be coming up for the first time, anytime from probably 30th of June right through to, I think the latest client I know at the moment has got 28th of April set as their date. That range of dates is there's quite a lot of work to do in between. And I think that document, I think this first one's a best endeavors basis, but I think going on from there, there'll be more focus, more scrutiny. And it's a window, or a window into the way the organization behaves and sort of conducts itself for the FCA to look at it, and they sort of make what they do from what they can see firms put into that document when they ask for it, when they do a supervisory review evaluation process meeting, SREP, as it's commonly known.
Some cool names there, MIF 007, like that. But,
it's a MIF return. Sorry, I'm throwing jargon out there. I apologize.
No, all good. So I guess just briefly, if you can, kind of, if you were speaking to one of your kind of clients today and trying to give them an overview of what a solid or a positive IFPR policy would look like, and what the benefit for them is, how would you advise that client?
I think it would be one that sort of sets out sort of the minimum requirements and how they're sort of following that as a firm, but then also call out the key areas of judgment that they're sort of making sure those are sort of highlighted to the board, and they're sort of they're able to follow that through. And then sort of links through into their approach to the ICARA, who's going to be involved in it, what they're going to do, and when they're going to do it. So setting that out clearly, and sort of something that's sort of overarching enough that becomes almost set in stone that these are the minimum things you need to go and do, and then the sort of the key things that fall out from it are clearly ring-fenced and defined. And I think the two maybe three key things are going to be the approach to returns is sort of spelt out for any judgment that you're going to take. The approach to the ICARA is very clear, because you want to have a firm tone, you want to have tone from the top fed into that document. And then, I mean, the third thing I was sort of thinking about is what you're going to say publicly. So whether that be in your financial statements or on your website around some of the capital disclosures you need to make. So just getting that right. So in old terms, that was sort of pillar 1 was the regulatory returns, pillar 2 was the ICARA, which was ICAP, and then pillar 3 was the external disclosures you made. So getting that sort of set out and laid out is key.
Perfect. And in terms of, it's always tricky with regulation, right? Because it's, to your point, even if people are distantly aware of it, it's something that you can't ignore. But how are you finding firms responding to these new requirements, and how is take up developing?
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, generally speaking, I think some reacted quite late in the day. I think actually not much of my client base. I think most of those had fairly good transitions, I would say. I mean, I think it's obviously there's a judgment, there's still ongoing work, but generally speaking, I think it's been quite smooth. I mean, some of them, it has impacted transaction activity for, so if you're an asset manager buying another asset manager, or if your fund is buying an asset management firm, actually you think about, is it adequately capitalized? Is there a risk that, the FCA might put some sanctions on that business if it's not? But I think generally speaking, most businesses have been sort of taking it seriously. I think the ones who haven't yet, probably one maybe sort of aren't factor highly on the FCA's review list, but two, I think the risk that's there is the FCA obviously picks firms at random and wants to go and see as many of its clients on its database as possible to sort of check they're adhering to the rules. So I think that therein is the risk for firms, the upside of doing a brilliant conversion. If you can live the value of it is amazing, but sometimes I think firms see it as a bit of a cost exercise. So it's just getting that balance right.
No, definitely. And I guess for any listeners out there that are starting to, think about their options around IPR, no doubt Shailen would be very open to discussing that with you. Cool. So Shailen, look, about to kind of, I guess, coming towards the end of our discussion now, but we've discussed 2 points, ESG, IFPR, and I really appreciate your input around that. I guess this is the bit where it becomes a bit self-serving from my perspective. So in terms of candidates out there that are considering careers and are maybe acutely aware of these kind of topics, are there any skills or knowledge that you would advise those candidates to kind of equip themselves with to make them stand out from the crowd going forward?
I think certainly on the IPR, I mean, assuming they're not going for a regulatory reporting role, in which case they should be all over it. But I think having general awareness of it and sort of being able to understand at least the importance of it in sort of financial forecasting, in terms of deals, just in terms of reporting more generally, it is probably quite helpful. On the ESG front, I think, again, probably understanding a little bit about how it's developing, what sort of reporting change there will be, potentially looking at what opportunities that might create from their role or that are going into and what they could contribute to it so that they could be on the front foot with something, might set them apart from the average candidate, because I think lots of firms are still grappling with this, and without sort of having in people coming in internally who've even thought about it, they won't change. And so if candidates are coming in and thinking about it a little bit more broadly, and able to sort of demonstrate their understanding of the topic, or share what they're seeing in a way that they sort of say, this is how I'd help to develop the role beyond what the spec says, that I think there's ways to stand out there that perhaps you would ordinarily see otherwise.
No, absolutely, all makes sense.
I hope that answers the question.
No, definitely very useful. Brilliant. All right, Shailen, look, I know you're a busy man, because I know it's taken a while for me to track you down for this call, but really genuinely appreciate your time and your input.